The wind howled across the barren tundra like a wounded mammoth, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin and threatened to freeze the breath in their throats. Grok pressed his massive frame against the rocky outcrop, his thick brow ridge casting deep shadows over eyes that scanned the white wasteland before him. His Homo erectus features, prominent jaw, receding forehead, and powerful build, marked him as the undisputed alpha of his hunter-gatherer band. The muscles beneath his mammoth hide cloak rippled with each movement, a testament to countless hunts and battles for survival. Food, scarce, he grunted in their primitive tongue, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter air that seemed to hang frozen for moments before dissipating. Behind him, 7 other members of his band huddled together in a tight cluster, their animal skin garments sewn together with sinew and bone needles, doing little to ward off the merciless cold that had gripped the land for countless moons. The temperature had dropped so low that even their saliva would freeze if they opened their mouths too long. Jack, barely past his youth with gangly limbs still growing into his frame, shivered violently as he clutched a sharpened stick with white-knuckled fingers. The orphaned gatherer had lost his parents to saber-toothed cats 2 seasons ago during a failed hunt, and now depended entirely on the band's protection and scraps from their kills. His stomach cramped with hunger. They hadn't eaten proper meat in 4 days, surviving only on frozen roots and withered berries he'd managed to scrape from beneath the snow with bleeding fingernails. His cheeks had hollowed, and his ribs were beginning to show through his thin covering of fur and skin. "Grok," wheezed Tom, the eldest firekeeper whose weathered hands trembled uncontrollably as he struggled to maintain their precious flame with the last few twigs they possessed. "Fire! Dying. Wood. Gone." His words came in short gasps, each breath a visible puff of vapor that seemed to mock their desperate situation. The old one's joints ached terribly in this cold, swollen and stiff, and everyone knew he might not survive another moon of such harsh conditions. His eyes, once sharp and alert, now held the glazed look of one whose body was slowly shutting down. Vera, a sturdy female with powerful shoulders built for carrying heavy loads and thick arms scarred from years of hard labor, pulled her infant closer to her chest. The child was weak, its cries growing fainter each day as her milk dried up from lack of nourishment, and she could feel its tiny ribs pressing against her palm. She had already lost one mate to a cave bear attack during the previous winter, watching helplessly as the massive predator dragged his broken body into the darkness, and now the fear of losing her offspring consumed her thoughts day and night, making sleep impossible. The other band members, Erg the wounded hunter whose leg had never healed properly from a mammoth goring, Nala the young mother whose twin infants had died of fever, and Brock the scarred tracker, all bore the same desperate look of creatures pushed to their absolute limits. Their primitive tools lay scattered around them, crude spears with fire-hardened tips, stone axes chipped and worn, scraping tools made from mammoth ribs. Through the swirling snow that cut visibility to mere arm's lengths, Grok's keen eyes spotted movement in the distance. Dark shapes moved against the white landscape like shadows given form. Other hominids, perhaps a dozen or more, their figures wavering in the heat mirages that rose even in this frozen wasteland. His muscles tensed, ready for either fight or flight, every instinct honed by years of survival screaming warnings. In these desperate times, encountering another band could mean either salvation through trade and cooperation, or death through violent competition for the scarce resources that meant the difference between life and starvation. "Others, come," Grok growled, his voice carrying a warning that made every member of his band freeze in alertness, their primitive weapons instinctively gripped tighter. The shapes grew larger as they approached through the blowing snow, and soon the distinctive silhouettes of fellow Homo erectus became clear against the stark landscape. But something was different about this group. They moved with a peculiar, almost defeated gait. Their heads hung low and their steps uncertain, like animals that had lost their way. As the strangers drew closer through the stinging wind, Grok could see they were all females, their faces marked by grief and exhaustion that went beyond mere physical hardship. Their clothing was torn and patched repeatedly, their bodies bearing the unmistakable marks of recent violence, claw marks, bite wounds, and the pale lines of old scars. These were survivors, widows whose males had fallen to some terrible fate, left to fend for themselves in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or unprotected. The lead female was particularly striking in her profound sorrow. Kyla's broad frame spoke of years of hard survival, muscles developed from a lifetime of gathering, carrying, and fighting, but her eyes held the hollow look of one who had lost everything precious in this world. Deep scars crossed her arms and face like a map of pain, telling stories of battles fought and barely won against predators, rival bands, and the endless cruelty of nature itself. She carried no weapons, save a crude digging stick worn smooth by countless hours of use, yet something in her bearing, the way she held her shoulders, the steadiness of her gaze despite her grief, commanded respect, even from hardened survivors like Grok's band. The two groups faced each other across the frozen wasteland, steam rising from their bodies in the frigid air like the breath of dying spirits, neither sure whether these strangers represented hope for survival or disaster that would consume them all. The tension crackled in the frozen air as both groups studied each other with the wariness of creatures who had learned that survival often depended on making split-second decisions about friend or foe. Grok's band pressed closer together, their primitive weapons at the ready, while the group of widowed females stood motionless in the swirling snow, their grief-stricken faces betraying no hint of aggression or fear. Brock, the scarred tracker whose face bore the permanent reminder of a wolverine's claws, was the first to break the silence with a harsh laugh that echoed across the wasteland. "Look, weak females," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt as he gestured toward the approaching widows with his stone-tipped spear. "No males, no protection, like wounded prey animals, waiting for death." His words carried the cruel edge of a predator who had spotted easy victims, and several other band members began to chuckle darkly at his observation. Urs, the wounded hunter whose permanently damaged leg had left him bitter and resentful toward any sign of weakness in others, limped forward with his crude axe raised. "Where males?" he called out mockingly, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. "Dead? Eaten by real hunters?" He made exaggerated sniffing motions with his flattened nose, as if trying to catch the scent of fear. These nothing but widow monkeys, useless females who let their mates die." The cruel laughter spread through Grok's band like wildfire, fed by their own desperation and the psychological need to feel superior to someone, anyone, in their current dire circumstances. Even young Jack, despite his natural compassion, found himself caught up in the mob mentality, pointing at the widows and making chattering sounds meant to imitate the calls of lesser primates. monkey females," he chanted, his voice cracking with adolescent excitement at being included in the adults' mockery. Vera, clutching her weakening infant, joined in with particular viciousness. "My mate, strong hunter," she boasted, her voice rising above the wind as she gestured toward her baby. "These females, weak mates, weak bloodline, should have died with males." Her words were especially cruel because she herself lived in constant fear of losing her child, and attacking others' losses helped her feel temporarily safe from her own vulnerability. The widows absorbed the mockery in complete silence, their faces showing no reaction to the increasingly vicious taunts. Carla, their obvious leader, simply stood with her digging stick planted in the frozen ground, her scarred face expressionless as stone. Behind her, the other females, some young, some old, all bearing the marks of recent tragedy, remained equally motionless, as if they were carved from ice itself. "Maybe they no understand," Tom wheezed from his position near the dying fire, his aged voice carrying a particularly nasty edge. "Maybe too stupid, like animals who watch their young eaten by predators." He made a show of examining them more closely, his rheumy eyes squinting through the snow. "Yes. See the stupid in their faces. Stupid females who could not keep mates alive." Nala, the young mother who had lost her own twin infants to fever, stepped forward with tears freezing on her cheeks as she screamed at the widows. "You let your children die. Bad mothers, weak mothers." Her voice broke with hysteria, her grief over her own losses transformed into rage directed at these convenient targets. "My babies, they died because of sickness. But you just weak, useless, should be dead." The verbal assault continued to escalate, with each member of Grok's band trying to outdo the others in their cruelty. They made exaggerated gestures of weakness, pretended to stumble and fall to mock the widow's supposed helplessness, and called out increasingly vicious insults about their inability to protect their families. The cold air filled with their harsh laughter and jeering voices, creating a cacophony of human cruelty that seemed to make even the howling wind pause. Yet through it all, the widows remained absolutely silent and still. Not one of them flinched at the insults, Not one showed anger or fear or any reaction whatsoever. They simply stood there in the blowing snow like ancient monuments to grief, their eyes fixed on some point beyond their tormentors, as if they were looking at something invisible to the mocking band. Grok himself had remained silent during the initial outburst, but now he stepped forward with a cruel grin spreading across his heavy features. As the alpha, his words would carry the most weight, and he intended to establish his band's dominance over these apparently defenseless females. "Widow monkeys," he said slowly, savoring each word like a predator savoring the taste of fresh blood. "We, strong band. You, nothing. Maybe we take your food, your furs. Maybe leave you for wolves to find." His threat hung in the frozen air like a death sentence, and his band members nodded eagerly at the prospect of taking whatever meager possessions these females might have. After all, in their minds, what could a group of grieving widows possibly do to stop them? They were clearly weak, clearly broken by whatever tragedy had befallen their males, and clearly no match for Grok's still intact hunter-gatherer band. But as Grok's words echoed across the wasteland, something subtle began to change in the widow's posture. Almost imperceptibly, they began to shift their weight, their stance becoming more centered, more balanced. And for the first time since the encounter began, Kayla's eyes moved to look directly at Grok, her gaze carrying a weight that made even the powerful alpha feel a momentary flicker of uncertainty deep in his primitive brain. The moment stretched like a taut sinew between predator and prey, with Grok's band still basking in their perceived superiority, while the widows maintained their statue-like stillness. The wind had begun to die down slightly, creating an eerie quiet that made every breath and heartbeat seem unnaturally loud in the frozen wasteland. Ice crystals continued to drift down from the grey sky, settling on the shoulders and hair of both groups, like nature's own burial shroud. Then, without warning, the silence was broken by something that made every member of Grok's band freeze mid-laugh. It started as a low rumble deep in Carla's chest, so deep that at first it seemed more felt than heard. The sound emerged from her throat like the growl of some massive predator, but there was something distinctly different about it, something that spoke not of animal aggression, but of profound ancient knowledge. Her scarred face remained expressionless, but her mouth opened slightly to release this primordial sound that seemed to come from the very depths of her being. The rumble grew steadily in volume and complexity, transforming from a simple growl into something that resembled speech, yet transcended it entirely. It was as if she were speaking in a language that existed before words, a form of communication that bypassed the crude grunts and gestures that Grok's band used and went directly to some deeper, more primal understanding. The sound carried across the frozen landscape with an otherworldly quality, seeming to bounce off the rocky outcroppings and return with added resonance. Then, one by one, the other widows began to join in. The second female, a younger woman with distinctive ritual scars covering her arms, added her voice to Kayla's with perfect timing and pitch. Her sound harmonized with the leaders in a way that created complex overtones, vibrations that seemed to penetrate not just the ear, but the very bones of anyone listening. The third widow joined, then the fourth, each adding their own unique vocal signature to what was becoming an increasingly intricate symphony of prehistoric communication. Grok's band members felt their mocking laughter die in their throats as the sound grew more complex and powerful. What they were hearing was unlike anything in their experience, not the simple howls of wolves calling to their pack, not the roars of great cats marking territory, not even the trumpeting of mammoths in distress. This was something entirely different, something that spoke of intelligence and coordination, far beyond what they had assumed these weak females possessed. Jack, the young orphan, felt his primitive spear begin to tremble in his grip as the harmonized sounds seemed to wrap around him like invisible tendrils. The hair on his arms stood on end despite the cold, and he found himself stepping backward involuntarily, his adolescent bravado evaporating like mist before the sun. What they do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing chorus of the widow's strange vocalizations. Old Tom, whose years of experience had taught him to recognize danger in all its forms, felt his weathered hands shake more violently as he clutched his fire-keeping tools. Never heard like this," he gasped, his rheumy eyes wide with a fear he couldn't name. "This not normal sound, this something else." The dying fire behind him seemed to flicker and dance in response to the strange acoustic patterns, as if even the flames were affected by whatever the widows were doing. The sound continued to build and evolve, with each widow adding layers of complexity that created an acoustic phenomenon unlike anything the natural world typically produced. It wasn't just noise. There were patterns within patterns, rhythms that seemed to pulse in time with the listener's heartbeats, frequencies that resonated in ways that made the very ground beneath their feet seem to vibrate sympathetically. Vera pressed her weakening infant closer to her chest as the child began to whimper in response to the otherworldly chorus. Her maternal instincts screamed warnings she couldn't articulate, telling her that whatever was happening here was far beyond her understanding or control. "Make them stop," she pleaded to Grok, her voice rising toward hysteria. "Make them stop that thing they doing." But Grok himself was transfixed, his alpha confidence shaken by the realization that he was witnessing something completely outside his experience. These weren't the desperate cries of weak, grieving females. This was a demonstration of knowledge and ability that his band couldn't hope to comprehend, let alone counter. His massive hands gripped his stone axe with white knuckles, but for the first time in years he wasn't sure that brute strength would be enough to handle the situation. The widow's vocalizations began to take on an almost hypnotic quality, with subtle shifts in tone and rhythm that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to some deeper part of the brain where fear and instinct resided. The sounds seemed to echo not just off the rocky formations around them, but off something invisible in the air itself, creating a three-dimensional acoustic space that enveloped both groups in its influence. As the chorus reached a crescendo that made the very air seem to thrum with power, Brock the scarred tracker found himself backing away, despite his earlier bravado. This not right," he muttered, his damaged face pale beneath his scars. "Females not supposed to do this thing. This something wrong, something bad." Yet even as Grok's band retreated in confusion and growing fear, the widows maintained their perfect formation, their voices weaving together in patterns that suggested not just communication, but command, as if they were not merely making sounds, but actually speaking to forces beyond the understanding of ordinary hominids, calling upon knowledge that had been passed down through generations of survivors who had learned to do more than simply endure. The widow's harmonized vocalizations suddenly shifted, becoming something even more unsettling than before. What had started as a deep, rumbling chorus now began to incorporate clicks, whistles, and guttural stops that created an entirely new acoustic landscape. It was as if they were speaking in the tongue of the caves themselves, using sounds that seemed to emerge from the very bones of the earth. Carla's voice became the focal point of this transformation, her scarred throat producing a series of clicks and resonant tones that seemed to map the rocky terrain around them. Each sound she made was immediately picked up and modified by her companions, creating an echo effect that made it seem as though the landscape itself was responding to their calls. The frozen air carried these sounds with crystalline clarity, bouncing them off ice formations and stone outcroppings in ways that created an almost supernatural acoustic environment. "Cave tongue," whispered Erg, the wounded hunter, his damaged leg trembling as he recognized something his grandfather had once described in terrified whispers around dying fires. Old ones. They spoke of this. Females who learned to speak with stone and ice. His words came out in short, panicked gasps, as ancestral memories of fear awakened in his primitive mind. The sound pattern began to change again, with the widows now producing what could only be described as conversation, but not conversation as Grok's band understood it. They were speaking to something unseen, their vocalizations taking on the rhythm and cadence of dialogue, with pauses that suggested they were listening to responses that only they could hear. Their eyes remained fixed on distant points, as if they were seeing far beyond the frozen wasteland, to places and entities invisible to ordinary sight. Nala, the young mother, felt her knees buckle as one particular sequence of sounds seemed to penetrate her skull like ice picks. They talking to dead," she sobbed, tears freezing instantly on her cheeks. "They talking to their dead mates, their dead children, making them come back." Her voice rose to a shriek of terror as her grief-addled mind conjured images of ghostly hominids emerging from the swirling snow. The acoustic phenomenon was growing more complex by the moment, with each widow now contributing distinct sound patterns that interlocked with the others like pieces of some vast invisible puzzle. What they were creating was beyond music, beyond simple communication. It was as if they were conducting a symphony of survival knowledge passed down through countless generations of females who had learned to thrive in the harshest conditions imaginable. Young Jack felt his bowels clench with terror as the sound seemed to crawl inside his head, creating vibrations that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. "Make it stop," he whimpered, dropping his sharpened stick as his hands flew to cover his ears. "Please, make it stop. It hurts. It hurts inside my head." But even with his palms pressed tightly against his skull, the sound seemed to penetrate through bone and flesh, reaching parts of his consciousness he didn't even know existed. Tom, the elderly firekeeper, began to recognize patterns in the vocalizations that reminded him of stories his own grandmother had told. Tales of the deep caves where ancient knowledge was preserved, where females had learned to read the voices of stone and ice and wind. They know the old ways," he gasped, his weathered face white with awe and terror. "Ways from before we forgot how to listen." The widow's chorus reached a new level of complexity as they began to incorporate what sounded like the voices of the landscape itself, the groaning of ice, the whisper of wind through stone passages, the deep rumble of earth settling. It was as if they had become conduits for the planet's own voice, channeling sounds that had been echoing through caves and canyons since the world was young. Vera clutched her infant so tightly that the child began to wail, its cries adding an eerie counterpoint to the widow's otherworldly performance. "They cursing us!" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "They calling down curse on our children, on our bloodline. They making our babies die like theirs did." Her maternal terror transformed the situation into a cosmic horror where the grieving widows were actively threatening the survival of her offspring. But even as Grok's band cowered in growing panic, there was something undeniably beautiful about what the widows were creating. Their voices wove together with a precision and harmony that spoke of years of practice, of knowledge refined through generations of survival. This wasn't random noise or simple mourning. This was a sophisticated form of communication that transcended anything Grok's band had ever imagined possible. The sound began to take on directional qualities, with certain vocalizations seeming to come from specific points in the landscape, rather than from the widows themselves. It was as if their voices were awakening echoes that had been sleeping in the rocks, calling forth responses from caverns and crevices that stretched far beneath the frozen surface. The very ground seemed to hum in harmony with their calls. Grok himself stood transfixed, his alpha instincts completely overwhelmed by this demonstration of power he couldn't comprehend or combat. His stone axe felt pathetically inadequate in his massive hands, as he realized that brute strength meant nothing against whatever force these females had tapped into. What you want?" he finally managed to croak, his voice barely audible above the continuing chorus. For the first time since the encounter began, Carla's eyes focused directly on him, though her voice never paused in its complex harmonizing with her companions. In that gaze, Grok saw not the broken grief he had expected, but a deep intelligence backed by knowledge that stretched back through countless generations of survival. These weren't just widowed females. They were keepers of something far older and more powerful than his band's simple understanding of hunting and gathering. The moment Grok's trembling question left his lips, the widow's vocalizations underwent another dramatic transformation. What had been a complex chorus suddenly became something that could only be described as a summons, their voices rising and falling in patterns that seemed to call out across vast distances, reaching into hidden places where ancient knowledge slept beneath layers of ice and stone. Then, impossibly, the landscape began to respond. It started as a subtle vibration beneath their feet, so faint that at first Grok's band thought it might be their own trembling from cold and fear. But the sensation grew stronger, rhythmic pulses that seemed to emerge from deep underground caverns and travel upward through solid rock. The frozen ground beneath them began to resonate in harmony with the widow's calls, creating a bass note so low it was more felt than heard. "Earth moving," Grok gasped, his scarred face twisted with terror as he felt the ice-covered stones beneath his feet begin to vibrate in time with the otherworldly chorus. They making Earth speak." His primitive mind struggled to comprehend what was happening, falling back on the only explanation that made sense to his limited understanding. These females possessed power over the very ground they stood on. The ice formations around them began to sing. What started as barely audible creaking and settling sounds gradually evolved into something that resembled the widow's own vocalizations. Icicles hanging from the rocky overhangs began to chime against each other in patterns that matched the rhythm of the females' calls, creating a crystalline percussion that added new layers to their acoustic symphony. The sound was hauntingly beautiful and utterly terrifying, as if the frozen world itself had awakened and decided to join their otherworldly conversation. Jack, the young orphan, felt his legs give out entirely as he watched chips of ice begin to fall from the cliff faces in time with the widow's breathing. They controlling everything," he whispered, his voice barely audible as he sank to his knees on the frozen ground. Ice, rock, earth, everything listening to them. His adolescent mind reeled as he realized that the mocking laughter his band had directed at these weak females had been not just cruel, but catastrophically foolish. The wind itself seemed to change direction, swirling around the two groups in patterns that followed the complex rhythms of the widow's vocalizations. What had been chaotic gusts now moved with purpose and intention, carrying their voices farther across the wasteland and bringing back echoes from distant canyons and hidden valleys. It was as if the atmosphere itself had become an extension of their communication network. Old Tom's fire, which had been dying to mere embers, suddenly flared back to life as the changing wind patterns fed it new oxygen. But instead of the normal yellow-orange flames, the fire now danced with blues and greens that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the widow's calls. "Magic fire," he croaked, his ancient eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. They making spirits dance in flames. Old spirits, angry spirits. Vera's infant had stopped crying entirely, instead staring with unblinking eyes at the widows, as if the child could see something in their performance that the adults could not. The baby's unusual stillness was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire encounter, suggesting that whatever power these females wielded was affecting even the youngest and most innocent members of Grok's band. The acoustic phenomenon continued to evolve, with new sounds emerging from unexpected sources. Snow began to fall in patterns that created their own subtle percussion as the flakes struck different surfaces. The rocky outcroppings seemed to develop their own voices, producing deep, resonant tones that harmonized perfectly with the widow's vocalizations. Even the air itself seemed to thicken, carrying sounds farther and clearer than should have been physically possible. Nala, the young mother who had lost her twins, found herself swaying involuntarily to the rhythm of the otherworldly music. They singing our children back," she mumbled, her grief-addled mind creating connections that weren't there. "Singing all the lost ones back from the cold place, the dark place where spirits go." Her voice held a note of desperate hope mixed with terror, as if she both longed for and feared the possibility of reunion with her dead infants. The widows themselves seemed to be entering some kind of trance state, their bodies swaying in perfect synchronization as their voices grew stronger and more complex. Their eyes had rolled back until only the whites showed, and their breathing had synchronized into a single powerful rhythm that seemed to pulse through the very molecules of the frigid air. They were no longer simply making sounds. They had become living conduits for forces far beyond ordinary understanding. Herg, the wounded hunter, felt his damaged leg begin to throb in time with the bass notes that continued to emerge from deep underground. They waken things," he gasped, his face pale with recognition of something his ancestors had feared. "Things that sleep in deep places, things that should stay sleeping." His words carried the weight of ancestral memories, genetic knowledge passed down through generations about dangers that existed beyond the physical world. As the phenomenon reached its peak, Grok realized with dawning horror that his band's cruel mockery had awakened something far more powerful and dangerous than a group of grieving widows. These females weren't broken survivors of some tragic loss. They were practitioners of knowledge so ancient and sophisticated that his band's primitive understanding of the world was like comparing a single twig to an entire forest. The ice-covered landscape around them had become a living instrument, with every surface contributing to a symphony that seemed to stretch across vast distances, connecting hidden places and awakening echoes that had been silent for countless seasons. And at the center of it all stood Carla and her companions, no longer appearing weak or defeated, but revealed as masters of powers that predated any memory or understanding Grok's people possessed. The widow's acoustic symphony reached a crescendo that seemed to pierce through dimensions of reality that Grok's band had never imagined existed. Their voices, now perfectly synchronized with the responding landscape, began to produce sounds that carried across the frozen wasteland with supernatural clarity. Each vocalization seemed to travel for miles, bouncing off distant mountains and returning with added power, as if the entire region had become a vast echo chamber designed to amplify their otherworldly calls. Then, from the horizon, came the first answer that chilled Grok's blood more than the bitter wind ever could. A howl, long, mournful, and unmistakably predatory, rolled across the tundra like thunder. But this wasn't the familiar cry of wolves that the band knew and feared. This sound was deeper, more resonant, carrying undertones that spoke of creatures far larger and more dangerous than anything that should exist in their world. The howl seemed to harmonize with the widow's vocalizations, as if whatever was making that sound understood and was responding to their mysterious communication. "Dire wolves," breathed Tom, his ancient voice barely audible as ancestral terror flooded through his weathered frame. "The old stories, the great hunters from the deep ice, thought they were just tales to frighten children." His rheumy eyes searched the distant horizon desperately, knowing that if the legends were true, nothing in his experience had prepared him for what was coming. A second howl joined the first, then a third, each one coming from a different direction, but all carrying the same impossible depth and power. The sounds seemed to circle their position, suggesting that whatever was making them was coordinating its approach with strategic intelligence far beyond that of normal predators. These weren't random animals drawn by curiosity. They were responding to a specific summons, answering a call they understood in ways that Grok's band could not even begin to comprehend. Jack, the young orphan, felt his bladder release as the terrible reality of their situation crashed over him. They calling the giant wolves," he sobbed, his voice cracking with terror as he pointed with a shaking finger toward the distant shapes that were beginning to materialize through the swirling snow. "The widow females, they calling them monsters to come eat us." His adolescent mind, overwhelmed by the supernatural events unfolding around him, could only process what was happening in terms of immediate physical threat. The creatures emerging from the frozen landscape were indeed wolves, but wolves unlike any that Grok's band had ever encountered. Each one stood as tall as a cave bear, their massive frames covered in thick fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their eyes glowed with an intelligence that went far beyond animal instinct, and their movements displayed a coordination that suggested they operated as a single, unified entity rather than a simple pack. Vera clutched her infant to her chest as she counted the approaching shapes, at least 8 of the massive predators, possibly more still hidden in the distance. "Too many," she whispered, her voice hollow with the certain knowledge that her child would not survive what was coming. "Even if we run, too many. They faster, stronger, they catch us, eat us all." Her maternal instincts screamed at her to flee, but her rational mind knew that flight was impossible against creatures of this size and apparent intelligence. The dire wolves moved with an eerie silence, despite their massive size, their enormous paws making no sound on the frozen ground as they began to form a loose circle around both groups. Their approach was methodical, patient, suggesting they were in no hurry to attack because they knew their prey had nowhere to go. The largest among them, a creature that seemed more shadow than flesh, positioned itself directly between Grok's band and their only escape route. Brok, the scarred tracker, raised his primitive spear with hands that shook uncontrollably. "We fight," he croaked, though his voice held no conviction. We make them pay for our blood." But even as he spoke, his eyes were already calculating the impossible odds they faced. His spear, which had served him well against ordinary wolves and even cave bears, looked pathetically inadequate against creatures of this supernatural size and apparent intelligence. The widow's vocalizations began to change once again, shifting from their previous harmonious chorus to something that sounded distinctly like conversation. They were speaking to the dire wolves in their strange cave tongue, their voices carrying subtle variations in tone and rhythm that suggested they were giving detailed instructions rather than simply calling for help. The massive predators responded with low rumbles and subtle shifts in position, confirming that this was indeed some form of complex communication. Nala, the young mother, fell to her knees as she watched the impossible scene unfold before her. They friends with monsters," she gasped, her mind struggling to process the implications of what she was witnessing. "The widow females, they not helpless. They command the giant wolves. They make them come to punish us for laughing." Her voice rose to a shriek of despair as she realized that their cruel mockery had awakened forces far beyond anything they could hope to combat or escape. Erg, the wounded hunter, tried to back away from the closing circle of predators, but his damaged leg betrayed him and sent him sprawling on the frozen ground. From that helpless position, he could see the dire wolf's eyes more clearly, and what he saw there made his heart stop. These weren't the simple, predatory gazes of hungry animals. These creatures looked at him with the calculating intelligence of hunters who were evaluating not just his physical capabilities, but his worth as prey, his potential as a threat, and perhaps even his role in the insults that had been hurled at their mysterious allies. Grok himself stood frozen with a terror unlike anything he had ever experienced, his alpha confidence completely shattered by the realization that his band had stumbled into something far beyond their understanding or ability to handle. The massive stone axe in his hands, which had made him feel invincible against other hominids and ordinary predators, now seemed like a child's toy in the face of creatures that seemed to have stepped out of the darkest legends of his people. The widows continued their otherworldly communication with the dire wolves, their voices rising and falling in patterns that created an acoustic web connecting the massive predators in ways that transcended simple pack coordination, suggesting a level of interspecies cooperation that shouldn't have been possible in the natural world. The circle of dire wolves tightened with predatory precision, their massive forms moving through the snow like living shadows that seemed to absorb both light and hope. Each step they took brought them closer to Grok's terrified band, their glowing eyes never blinking as they maintained perfect formation around their trapped prey. The largest of the pack, a creature whose shoulder height matched that of a fully grown cave bear, positioned itself directly in front of Grok, its intelligent gaze boring into the alpha male's soul with unmistakable judgment. Kayla's voice suddenly cut through the supernatural chorus, speaking for the first time since the encounter began. Her words came in the crude tongue that Grok's band understood, but her voice carried harmonics and undertones that made the simple syllables resonate with power that seemed to emerge from the very bones of the earth beneath their feet. "You mock the grieving," she said slowly, each word dropping into the frozen air like stones into deep water. "You laugh at mothers who lost children to ice death. You call us weak monkey female." Her scarred face remained expressionless, but her voice carried a weight of accusation that made even the dire wolves pause in their steady advance, as if they too were listening to pass judgment on the accused. Behind her, the other widows ceased their vocalizations and stood in perfect silence, their grief-marked faces turned toward Grok's band with expressions that mixed profound sorrow with terrible resolve. These weren't the broken survivors his band had assumed them to be. They were judges, executioners of some ancient code that demanded justice for cruelty shown to the bereaved and desperate. We not know," Grok stammered, his massive frame trembling as he tried to find words that might somehow undo the mockery his band had heaped upon these mysterious females. "We hungry, cold. We speak from empty belly fear." But even as he spoke, he knew that his explanations sounded pathetic and inadequate in the face of the supernatural forces arrayed against them. "Fear," Kayla repeated, her voice taking on new layers of meaning as she spoke the word. "Yes, you know fear now. You know what we feel every sunrise, every sunset, every breath we take in world that took our mates, our children, our hope." Her eyes fixed on each member of Grok's band in turn, as if memorizing their faces for some cosmic accounting that would follow them beyond death itself. The largest dire wolf took another step forward, its breath creating clouds of vapor that seemed to carry the scent of ancient graveyards and forgotten battlefields. When it opened its massive jaws, the band could see teeth the size of spear points, yellowed with age, but sharp enough to crush bone with ease. A low rumble emerged from deep in its chest, a sound that seemed to ask permission for violence, that it was eager to dispense. Young Jack collapsed completely, curling into a ball on the frozen ground as terror overwhelmed his ability to remain upright. "Sorry," he whimpered, his voice barely audible through his sobs. "Sorry we laughed. Sorry we called you names. Please don't let them eat us. We just hungry and scared like you." His youthful honesty cut through the supernatural tension like a knife, creating the first crack in the wall of judgment that surrounded them. One of the younger widows, a female with distinctive ritual markings on her arms, stepped forward slightly and made a soft clicking sound that caused the dire wolves to pause in their advance. Her voice joined Kayla's, but with a different quality, not the deep earth-shaking power of the matriarch, but something that carried notes of compassion mixed with steel-hard resolve. "The young one," she said, nodding toward Jack's trembling form. He speaks truth words. Fear makes cruel. Hunger makes mockery seem like strength. Her scarred hands gestured toward the rest of Grok's band. But cruelty to grieving mothers. This brings consequences that echo through seasons, through generations. Vera, still clutching her weakening infant, found her voice despite her terror. My baby dies soon if cold continues, she said, her words coming out in desperate gasps. I laughed at your loss because I fear my own, because mocking your pain made mine seem less real. Her confession emerged like blood from a wound, painful, but necessary for any hope of survival. Tom, the elderly firekeeper, struggled to his feet despite his aching joints and faced Carla directly. I am old. I know old stories, old ways. Your voices, they speak like the deep cave mothers from before time. I should have warned Band to show respect. His weathered face creased with genuine remorse as he realized he had failed in his duty as keeper of ancestral wisdom. The dire wolves shifted restlessly, their massive bodies radiating barely contained violence as they awaited some signal from their mysterious allies. The largest of them, clearly the pack leader, fixed its glowing eyes on Grok with an expression that suggested it was evaluating him not just as prey, but as something that had violated laws far older than any human understanding of justice. Respect, Kayla said slowly, her voice carrying new inflections that seemed to make the word itself resonate through multiple dimensions of meaning. You speak of respect now, when death circles you like hungry ravens, but where was respect when you saw our grief, our loss, our desperate survival? Her digging stick, still planted firmly in the frozen ground, seemed to pulse with each word she spoke. The supernatural chorus began again, but softer now, with the other widows adding their voices in patterns that seemed designed not to summon or command, but to weigh and measure. They were conducting some form of trial by acoustic jury, using their otherworldly communication to debate the fate of their tormentors in languages that predated any human understanding of law or justice. Brock, the scarred tracker, dropped his spear entirely and spread his empty hands toward the widows in a gesture of complete surrender. We beg forgiveness, he said, his voice breaking with emotion he had never known he possessed. We beg for chance to make right the wrong words we spoke. The admission cost him everything he thought he was, but in the face of supernatural judgment, false pride seemed like a luxury he could no longer afford. As the supernatural trial continued in the frozen wasteland, something unexpected began to emerge from the terror and desperation that had consumed both groups. Jack, still curled on the ground but no longer sobbing, slowly raised his head and looked directly at one of the younger widows, the same female who had spoken with compassion mixed with steel. Her eyes, dark and deep with grief but not hardened by it, met his with an expression that seemed to recognize something familiar in his orphaned state. You lost parents too, she said softly, her voice carrying none of the otherworldly harmonics that had characterized the widow's earlier communications. I see in your eyes, same emptiness that lives in mine since my mate fell to ice bear claws. Her words created a bridge across the supernatural divide that had separated the two groups, a connection based on shared understanding of loss rather than fear or power. The young widow's name was Nima, and as she spoke, some of the other widows' vocalizations softened, their supernatural chorus taking on gentler tones that seemed to acknowledge this moment of human recognition. The dire wolves, still maintaining their threatening circle, began to relax slightly, their massive forms settling into more patient postures as if they too recognized that something important was happening. Jack slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position, his adolescent frame still trembling, but his eyes now focused on Nima with something approaching hope. Ice Bear killed mine too, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. Big male, bigger than 3 hominids. They tried to protect food cache. Bear took them and food both. The memory brought fresh tears to his eyes, but these were tears of shared grief rather than terror. Kayla's expression, which had remained stern and judgmental throughout the confrontation, began to show subtle changes as she watched this exchange between the two orphaned young ones. Her deep vocalizations shifted to include new harmonics that seemed to acknowledge the possibility of connection across the divide of their conflict, though her stance remained resolute and her judgment far from complete. Old Tom, drawing on reserves of wisdom accumulated over many harsh seasons, began to recognize patterns in the widow's supernatural abilities that connected to stories from his own past. "Your voices," he said slowly, addressing Carla with newfound respect. "They speak like my grandmother's grandmother. The deep cave teachings, the ways of making stone and ice. Speak back. Thought all who knew such things were lost to time." "Not lost," replied the widow with ritual scars, her voice carrying notes of both pride and profound sadness. "Hidden, preserved, passed down through daughters when sons could not hear the old frequencies." Her words suggested that the knowledge these females possessed wasn't supernatural at all, but rather a sophisticated understanding of acoustics and environmental communication that had been carefully maintained by generations of mothers who understood that survival sometimes required abilities beyond simple hunting and gathering. The revelation began to transform the supernatural terror that had gripped Grok's band into something approaching awe and understanding. These weren't mystical beings commanding otherworldly forces. They were practitioners of ancient knowledge, keepers of survival techniques so refined and complex that they seemed magical to those who had forgotten such things were possible. Vera, still holding her weakening infant, took a tentative step forward despite the proximity of the dire wolves. Your children," she said hesitantly, addressing the group of widows. "What took them?" "Same ice sickness that weakens mine." Her question carried genuine concern rather than mockery, a mother's instinct to understand threats that might affect all children, regardless of band loyalty. "Different deaths," Carla replied, her voice taking on new depths of sorrow as she recounted losses too profound for simple words. "Ice sickness took 2. Cave-enduring tunnel digging took 1. Starvation took the youngest when last winter stretched too long." Each loss she described seemed to add weight to her already heavy bearing, but also to emphasize the strength required to survive such devastation. The dire wolves, responding to some subtle shift in their allies' vocalizations, began to move from their threatening positions around Grok's band to form a different kind of circle, one that included both groups rather than separating hunter from prey. The largest pack member, still imposing but no longer radiating immediate violence, settled into a resting position that suggested the immediate threat of attack had passed. "They not monsters," Nima said, gesturing toward the massive predators with obvious affection. "They family now. When Ban died, when males all gone, they came to us in deep cave, hungry, cold, alone like us. We shared last food, they shared warmth. We learned their speech, they learned ours." Her explanation revealed that the supernatural communication between widows and dire wolves was actually the result of desperate cooperation between species facing similar survival challenges. Erg, the wounded hunter, whose damaged leg had made him particularly vulnerable during the confrontation, looked at the dire wolves with new understanding. "They outcasts too," he said slowly, recognition dawning in his primitive mind. "Pack animals without pack, like us, but bigger, stronger." His words carried a note of kinship with creatures he had moments before seen as demonic threats. Grok himself, his alpha status shaken but his intelligence intact, began to see possibilities beyond the immediate crisis. "Your knowledge," he said carefully, addressing Kayla with the respect he should have shown from the beginning. "Cave speaking, ice reading, wolf calling. These survival gifts could help all survive winter that kills so many." His words carried the first suggestion that cooperation might be possible between groups that had seemed destined for conflict. The supernatural tension that had dominated the encounter began to transform into something more complex, a negotiation between desperate survivors who had initially seen each other as either threats or easy victims, but who were beginning to recognize potential for mutual benefit. The widow's otherworldly abilities weren't weapons of vengeance, but tools of survival that could benefit everyone if prejudice and cruelty could be set aside in favor of cooperation and respect. Carla's scarred face remained impassive as she studied Grok's proposal, her deep eyes weighing not just his words, but the sincerity behind them. The other widows continued their soft vocalizations, creating an acoustic backdrop that seemed to help them share thoughts and emotions in ways that Grok's band was only beginning to understand. The dire wolves, now resting in a loose circle that encompassed both groups, watched the proceedings with intelligent patience, their glowing eyes suggesting they too were part of this complex decision-making process. "Cooperation," Kayla said finally, her voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to test the very concept against the reality of what had transpired. You speak of joining when moments ago you called us weak monkeys, mocked our grief, threatened to take our possessions. Her words cut through the frigid air like obsidian blades, sharp with the memory of cruelty that couldn't be easily forgotten or forgiven. The young widow Nima stepped closer to where Jack sat, her movements careful and deliberate to avoid alarming either the dire wolves or Grok's band. "Words are wind," she said, her voice carrying notes of both wisdom and wariness. "Actions show true heart. If you seek alliance, if you truly wish to share survival knowledge, then show us worthiness through deeds, not desperate promises spoken when death circles close." Grok felt the weight of leadership settling on his massive shoulders, like stones in a hide pack. His band looked to him for salvation from the consequences of their collective cruelty, but he understood that any misstep now could doom them all. What test would prove our worth?" he asked, his voice stripped of the aggressive confidence that had characterized his earlier demands and threats. The widows exchanged glances loaded with meaning, their slight movements and subtle vocalizations creating a wordless conversation that excluded Grok's band entirely. The largest dire wolf raised its massive head and released a low rumble that seemed to add its own opinion to the deliberations, though what that opinion might be remained mysterious to those who hadn't learned the complex language of interspecies cooperation. "Winter brings many tests," Kayla replied after the silent consultation concluded, "but one approaches now that will measure strength, courage, and wisdom together." She gestured with her digging stick toward a distant range of hills barely visible through the swirling snow. 3 valleys beyond Ice Ridge, great mammoth herd moves south to escape worst cold. Old matriarch leads them, ancient female with tusks like fallen trees and wisdom that spans many seasons. Old Tom's roomy eyes widened with understanding and terror. "The ghost mammoth," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of legends passed down through generations. "Grandmother of all herds. They say her hide turned white as snow, that she knows secrets of survival from before the great ice came." His weathered hands trembled as he contemplated the implications of what Kayla was suggesting. "She is dying," Nima added, her voice soft with genuine grief for a creature she had apparently never met but respected deeply. "Old wounds from many battles, old age that makes each step agony. Soon she will lie down in snow and let cold take her, as is proper way for ancient ones. But her death will doom herd. They follow her because she remembers paths through ice, knows where water flows beneath frozen streams, can find grass beneath snow where others see only death." The test began to take shape in Grok's mind, and what he saw there filled him with dread. You want us to help dying mammoth? To save creature that could feed our band for full season?" The conflict between immediate survival needs and longer-term survival wisdom created tension that showed clearly in his heavy features. "More than help," Carla corrected, her voice taking on new depths of meaning. "You must choose. Take easy path, kill ancient matriarch, feed band for few days while herd scatters and dies. Or take hard path, find way to heal her wounds, restore her strength, save not just her but entire herd. First choice shows you still think like predators who see only immediate hunger. Second choice shows you understand deeper truths of survival." Vera clutched her infant closer as the implications became clear. But if we don't take meat, baby might die. Winter still has many moons left. How can choosing to let food escape be right choice? Her maternal instincts warred with the moral complexity of the situation, creating anguish that showed in every line of her tired face. "Because," replied the widow with ritual scars, her voice carrying notes of hard-won wisdom, "herd that survives this winter will breed next spring. Calves will be born, grow strong. One mammoth killed feeds band for short time. Herd saved feeds many bands for many seasons, through trading, through shared hunting when young ones are ready." Her explanation revealed planning that extended far beyond immediate gratification toward sustainable survival. The dire wolves stirred restlessly, their massive forms shifting positions in ways that suggested they too understood the complexity of the choice being presented. The pack leader's glowing eyes fixed on Grok, with an expression that seemed to evaluate not just his immediate response, but his capacity for the kind of long-term thinking that separated true leaders from mere dominators. Brok, the scarred tracker, found his voice despite his earlier surrender. How could we heal such creature? We have no knowledge of mammoth healing, no power to restore strength to ancient bones." His question carried genuine curiosity rather than skepticism, suggesting that the encounter with the widow's abilities had opened his mind to possibilities he had never considered. "That knowledge exists," Kayla said mysteriously, her scarred hands making subtle gestures that caused several of the dire wolves to raise their heads attentively. "But it requires trust, cooperation, willingness to learn ways that may seem strange to those who know only hunting and gathering. It requires putting aside pride, accepting that females might know things that males do not, that cooperation might achieve what force cannot." The test was more than a simple choice between immediate gratification and long-term benefit. It was a fundamental challenge to everything Grok's band believed about strength, leadership, and survival. Success would require them to abandon their prejudices, embrace knowledge they didn't understand, and work alongside beings they had recently mocked and threatened. Failure would likely mean death for all of them, either through starvation or through the justified wrath of creatures they had gravely underestimated. The journey to the mammoth herd's location took 2 days of grueling travel through snow that reached their thighs and wind that cut through their animal hide garments like ice-tipped spears. Grok's band and the widows moved together now, though the alliance remained fragile and untested. The dire wolves ranged ahead and behind their strange procession, their massive paws finding purchase on ice where smaller feet would slip, their keen senses alert for dangers that the combined groups might not detect. As they crested the final ridge, the sight that greeted them was both magnificent and heartbreaking. Below, in a sheltered valley, nearly 50 mammoths moved slowly through the snow, their massive forms creating a living landscape of brown fur and curved tusks. At the center of the herd, barely moving, stood the legendary matriarch that Carla had described. The ancient female was indeed ghostly in appearance, her fur having turned almost completely white with age and stress. Her tusks, once mighty weapons, now seemed too heavy for her aging head, and she held them at angles that spoke of joint pain and muscle weakness. Most telling of all, the herd remained clustered around her despite the obvious abundance of better grazing areas visible across the valley, their loyalty keeping them in suboptimal conditions because they refused to abandon their dying leader. "She beautiful," Jack whispered, his young voice filled with awe as he gazed upon the creature that had become legend even among their people. "And so tired, like she carrying weight of whole world on her back." His orphan's instinct for recognizing suffering allowed him to see past the mammoth's impressive size to the pain that consumed her ancient body. Nima moved beside him, her own eyes bright with unshed tears as she studied the matriarch's labored breathing. "My grandmother told stories of her," she said softly. "Said she was already old when grandmother was young child. Some say she remembers time before great ice, when grass grew green in valleys that now sleep under frozen stone." Her voice carried reverence mixed with deep sadness at witnessing the decline of such a magnificent being. Carla raised her digging stick and began a low, rhythmic vocalization that was immediately picked up by her fellow widows. But this wasn't the complex, otherworldly chorus they had used to communicate with the dire wolves. This was something gentler, more musical, with harmonies that seemed designed to carry across distances without alarming the massive creatures below. The sound drifted down into the valley like falling snow, soft but unmistakably present. The effect on the mammoth herd was immediate and remarkable. The younger animals, who had been restlessly pawing at the snow and showing signs of wanting to move to better feeding grounds, settled into calm attention. The matriarch herself raised her massive head, her small eyes searching for the source of sounds that seemed to speak directly to some deep memory in her ancient mind. They responding to your voices," Vera observed with wonder, her own infant stirring in response to the soothing harmonies the widows were creating. "Like the dire wolves, but different, more gentle." Her observation revealed that the widow's acoustic abilities extended far beyond commanding predators to include calming and healing communications with a wide range of species. Tom, drawing on his lifetime of accumulated wisdom, began to understand what he was witnessing. "The old stories," he murmured, his weathered face creasing with recognition. "They spoke of deep cave mothers who could speak with all creatures, not just other hominids. Thought it was just tale-telling to pass cold nights." His voice carried the amazement of someone discovering that childhood myths contained literal truths. The largest dire wolf, apparently responding to some signal from Carla, began making its way down the slope toward the mammoth herd. But instead of the predatory approach that might be expected, the massive predator moved with deliberate calm, its body language clearly communicating peaceful intentions. The mammoths watched its approach with wariness but not panic, suggesting that they recognized something non-threatening in the wolf's behavior. "We go now," Carla announced, her voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to include instructions for behavior around the massive herbivores. "Remember, no sudden moves, no aggressive gestures. These ancient ones read intention in body stance, in breath rhythm, in eye movement. They will know if we come as friends or threats before we speak single word." The descent into the valley felt like entering a sacred space where the normal rules of predator and prey had been suspended by forces far older than any of them could comprehend. The mammoth herd parted slowly to allow their approach, the younger animals showing curiosity rather than fear, while the adults maintained protective positions that could quickly become defensive if necessary. Up close, the matriarch's condition was even more heartbreaking than it had appeared from the ridge. Her breathing came in labored gasps that created clouds of vapor in the frigid air, and her legs trembled with the effort of supporting her massive weight. Most alarming of all, her left flank bore a partially healed wound that had clearly become infected, the surrounding tissue swollen and discolored in ways that spoke of poison spreading through her ancient body. "Wound from cave lion," Nima observed, her knowledge of animal injuries allowing her to read the story written in scar tissue and swelling. "Old attack, but infection never fully cleared, now spreading, making her weak, making her ready for final sleep." Her diagnosis confirmed what they could all see. Without intervention, the great matriarch would be dead within days. Grok stared at the infected wound and felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him like avalanche snow. His band could easily take this dying creature with minimal risk, providing meat that would keep them alive for weeks. But doing so would scatter the herd, dooming the younger animals to starvation and death, eliminating a resource that could sustain multiple bands for generations if properly preserved. "The healing knowledge," he said slowly, addressing Carla with the respect her abilities had earned. "You spoke of ways to restore strength to ancient bones. Is this possible for creature so far gone?" His question carried desperate hope, mixed with practical skepticism about whether any knowledge could reverse damage so severe. "Possible," Kayla replied, her eyes never leaving the suffering matriarch, "but requires sacrifice from all, not just cooperation but trust beyond anything your band has shown before. The healing we can attempt requires each person to give something precious, something that hurts to lose." Her words suggested that saving the mammoth would demand more than simple cooperation. It would require genuine transformation from everyone involved. The ancient matriarch's labored breathing created a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeats of everyone gathered around her massive form. Her small, intelligent eyes moved from face to face, studying each member of the unlikely alliance with the deep wisdom that comes only from surviving countless seasons of hardship. The infection in her flank had worsened during their approach, the swelling now clearly visible even beneath her thick white fur, and time was running out faster than winter daylight. Kayla began the healing ritual by placing both hands on the frozen ground and releasing a series of vocalizations unlike any they had heard before. These sounds were deeper than speech, older than language, carrying frequencies that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but in the bones and blood of every living thing present. The dire wolves arranged themselves in a protective circle around the mammoth, their massive bodies radiating warmth that helped create a pocket of relative comfort in the brutal cold. "The healing requires truth," Carla announced, her voice carrying harmonics that made even the simplest words seem heavy with cosmic significance. "Each person must offer what they value most, must speak aloud the deepest fear that drives them, must release the poison that lives in their own heart before we can draw poison from Ancient One's wound." Her words revealed that the healing would be as much about spiritual transformation as physical cure. Grok stepped forward first, understanding that his leadership demanded he take the greatest risk. I offer my stone axe," he said, his voice breaking as he placed his most prized possession, the weapon that had made him alpha, that had kept him alive through countless battles, on the ground beside the mammoth's massive head. "My deepest fear is that without strength of weapons, without power to dominate, I am nothing. That my band follows me only because I can hurt them more than others can." The confession hung in the frigid air like visible breath, and the ancient matriarch's eyes seemed to focus on him with new attention. Her trunk, weak though it was, extended slightly to touch the offered weapon, as if acknowledging both the gift and the courage required to speak such vulnerable truths. Young Jack was next, his adolescent voice trembling with emotion as he knelt beside the dying creature. I offer my gathering stick," he whispered, placing the sharpened tool that represented his only skill, his only value to the band, next to Grok's axe. "My fear is that I will always be useless, always be the one who needs protecting, never strong enough to save anyone else from what happened to my parents." His tears froze on his cheeks as he spoke, but his eyes remained fixed on the matriarch's face. Nima approached from the widow's side, her scarred hands steady as she placed a small pouch beside the growing pile of offerings. "My fire-making stones," she said clearly, her voice carrying notes of both sorrow and strength. "My fear is that I will forget the faces of my dead mate and children, that time will steal their memory from me and leave me with nothing but empty grief." The firestones represented survival itself in the harsh winter, making her sacrifice profound, beyond simple material value. One by one, each member of both groups came forward to add their most precious possession to the growing pile and speak their deepest fears aloud. Vera offered the soft fur blanket that kept her infant warm, admitting her terror that she would fail as a mother, just as she believed she had failed as a mate. Tom placed his fire-tending tools beside the other offerings, confessing his fear that his knowledge would die with him, leaving future generations without the wisdom needed for survival. As each person spoke their truth and made their sacrifice, something remarkable began to happen. The ancient matriarch's breathing seemed to grow less labored, her eyes brighter and more focused. More amazingly, the infected wound on her flank began to show signs of change, the angry swelling reducing slightly, the discolored tissue taking on healthier tones. "The poison in wounds mirrors poison in hearts," Kayla explained as she watched the transformation begin. "When we release what separates us from others, when we speak fears instead of hiding them, when we sacrifice what we think makes us strong, we create space for true healing to occur." Her words suggested that the physical healing was intimately connected to the emotional and spiritual cleansing taking place. But the most profound moment came when the dire wolves began to participate in the ritual. The pack leader approached the pile of offerings and, to everyone's amazement, began to cough up something from deep in its throat. What emerged was a collection of small bones and stones, not food remains, but carefully preserved tokens that the massive predator had apparently carried for seasons, perhaps the only remnants of its original pack before joining with the widows. The wolf's contribution seemed to trigger something in the mammoth matriarch that went beyond physical healing. She struggled to her feet with obvious effort, her massive frame swaying but holding steady, and reached out with her trunk to touch each person who had made an offering. When her trunk reached the dire wolf, the interaction between species created a moment of such profound connection that even the harsh winter wind seemed to pause in respect. "She accepting us," Nima whispered, wonder filling her voice as the ancient creature's trunk brushed gently against her scarred forehead. "All of us. Not as separate bands, separate species, but as family, as single group working together for survival." Her observation revealed that the healing ritual had accomplished far more than curing an infection. It had created bonds that transcended the normal boundaries between different forms of life. The physical transformation of the matriarch continued throughout the remainder of the day. Her breathing became stronger, her stance more stable, and most remarkably, the infected wound on her flank began to drain properly, releasing the poisonous fluids that had been slowly killing her. By evening, she was able to move freely around the valley, her trumpeting calls bringing answering responses from the herd members who had waited patiently for her recovery. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationships between the various members of their expanded group. Grok's band and the widows no longer stood apart from each other. They had become a single unit, bound together by shared sacrifice and mutual vulnerability. The cruel mockery that had begun their encounter seemed like something from another lifetime, replaced by respect born from true understanding of each other's struggles and strengths. 3 moons had passed since the healing of the ancient matriarch, and the transformation that had begun with sacrifice and vulnerability had blossomed into something that none of them could have imagined during those desperate days in the frozen wasteland. The combined group, no longer separate bands but a true community, had established themselves in a series of connected caves that offered protection from the worst of winter's fury while providing access to the resources they needed for survival. The mammoth herd, led by their restored matriarch, had become an integral part of their new way of life. Rather than hunting the massive creatures for immediate meat, they had learned to work with them in ways that benefited everyone. The mammoth's ability to break through ice to reach flowing water beneath had provided the community with a reliable source of fresh water throughout the coldest months. Their dung, when dried, burned slowly and steadily, supplementing the precious wood that was so scarce in the frozen landscape. Jack, no longer the frightened orphan who had cowered on the ground during their first encounter, had become a bridge between the older knowledge keepers and the practical needs of daily survival. Under Nima's patient teaching, he had learned to understand the basic elements of the cave tongue, the acoustic communication system that allowed the widows to coordinate complex activities across vast distances. His young mind, unencumbered by preconceptions about what was possible, had absorbed the knowledge with remarkable speed. "The ice song changes today," he announced to the gathered community, his voice carrying new confidence as he interpreted the subtle acoustic signals that Nima had taught him to recognize. "Matriarch says warmer air comes from southern valleys. Spring melt begins soon in high places." His ability to understand the mammoth's communication, filtered through the widow's translation, had made him invaluable as a weather predictor and resource scout. Grok, his leadership style transformed by the lessons learned during the healing ritual, no longer ruled through intimidation and brute strength. Instead, he had become a coordinator and facilitator, using his natural charisma and physical capabilities to help implement the decisions made by the community as a whole. The loss of his precious stone axe had initially left him feeling powerless, but he had discovered that true strength came from enabling others rather than dominating them. "Cave expansion finished," he reported to Kayla, who had naturally emerged as the community's primary decision-maker, despite never formally claiming leadership. "New passages connect all family groups, allow quick movement if predators threaten. Stoneworking tools made from mammoth bones work better than old flint tools ever did." His words reflected not just practical accomplishments, but a fundamental shift in how he understood the relationship between individual strength and community survival. The dire wolves had integrated seamlessly into the community structure, their pack instincts adapting to include the hominids as part of their extended family group. The largest wolf, whom Nima had begun calling Deep Voice for the distinctive rumbling quality of his communications, had become particularly attached to the children of the group, serving as both protector and playmate, in ways that would have seemed impossible during their first terrifying encounter. Vera's infant, who had been weakening dangerously during those desperate early days, had not only survived, but thrived in the warmth and security of the expanded community. The child had become a symbol of hope for everyone, proof that their new way of life could sustain and nurture the most vulnerable members of their group. More remarkably, the baby had begun to respond to the widow's vocalizations, with sounds that suggested an innate understanding of the cave tongue. "Little one speaks first words in old language," Vera announced with pride mixed with wonder as her child babbled in response to one of Kayla's gentle communications with the dire wolves. "Maybe new generation will know both ways, hunting words and deep cave words, strength of weapons and strength of cooperation." Her observation pointed toward a future where the artificial divisions between different forms of knowledge might be permanently healed. The ancient matriarch herself had become more than just a survivor of their healing intervention. She had become a teacher and guide whose presence enriched every aspect of their community life. Her ability to remember safe paths through dangerous terrain, to locate resources hidden beneath snow and ice, and to predict weather patterns had proven invaluable throughout the brutal winter months. As the first signs of spring began to appear in the form of longer daylight and slightly warmer temperatures, the community faced new decisions about their future. The mammoth herd would soon begin its annual migration to summer grazing grounds, and the question of whether to follow them or remain in their established cave system created the need for careful planning and discussion. "We could divide," suggested Tom, his aged wisdom now valued rather than merely tolerated. "Some follow herd, learn migration paths, establish relationships with other communities along the way. Others stay, develop cave systems further, create permanent base for knowledge-keeping and tool-making." His proposal reflected the community's new ability to think in terms of long-term strategies rather than mere day-to-day survival. But it was Nima who articulated the most profound realization that had emerged from their shared experiences. "We not same as before," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to include everyone present in her meaning. "Not separate bands fighting for scraps, not even cooperative groups sharing resources. We something new. Family of choice that includes all forms of life, all types of knowledge, all ways of being strong. The final decision came through a process unlike anything any of them had experienced before. Rather than argument, competition, or simple submission to the strongest voice, they used a combination of the widow's acoustic communication methods and traditional discussion to reach consensus. Every member of the community, from the oldest firekeeper to the youngest child, had input in the choice that would determine their future. They would follow the herd's migration, but not as simple nomads dependent on the movements of other creatures. Instead, they would become a new kind of community, mobile knowledge keepers who could adapt to changing seasons and circumstances while maintaining the deep connections with both environment and each other that had saved them from the cruelties of isolation and desperation. As they prepared for the journey ahead, the sounds that rose from their community were no longer the harsh cries of competing predators or the desperate pleas of the starving and afraid. Instead, their voices joined in a new kind of song, one that included the harmonics taught by the widows, the practical coordinating calls developed by the hunters, the joyful babbling of healthy children, and even the deep rumblings of their dire wolf companions. The mockery that had once filled the frozen air had been transformed into something that acknowledged the sacred nature of survival itself, not as a competition where the strong consumed the weak, but as a collaborative art, where every voice, every form of knowledge, and every type of strength contributed to a harmony that could sustain life even in the harshest conditions the world could offer.